This is session 9. The topic was white space and stanza breaks. We had a discussion primarily and then looked at the poems that were in the homework. The first thing is to know that stanzas are historical. I want to call them an almost genetic artifact. That is, poems evolve. And while evolution is talking about DNA, the DNA in a poem is the use factors of the culture which give it meaning which we don't control. So, for example, a couplet is a very common stanza. It's the most common stanza in English. I'm only speaking about English here because different cultures have different histories and experiences. So poetry in Farsi, Iranian poetry, for example, is going to have a different history than English poetry. The history of stanzas in the English language is loosely the same as the history of the novel, in the sense that when detective novels are the thing I read when I read novels generally, so that's what I'm going to talk about. The idea behind Miss Marple, for example, and Agatha Christie, is that the world comes right, that there are bad things that happen, but that the system holds. In Miss Marple, it's the system of the village. It goes back to normal after the murder, after the perpetrator is caught and taken away to face whatever the perpetrator is going to face. And that by care, intelligence, and observational skills, the world can be brought right again. It's a basic understanding of reality in Western Europe. I would say that the same thing is true with the notion of religion, for example, that there is an external stabilizing force, whether you call it God or something else, that will bring things right, even though there are troubles and there are things that go wrong, like murders in the village, but it comes right in the end. And the stanza is part of that tradition in English. And so our history of culture, which blew apart with 1914 and all the events that preceded and followed, was based on that basic presumption of reality. It no longer really holds. It might hold in individual cases if there's a firm belief in something external that's holding things together. But for the culture itself, for the sort of day-to-day mundanity of things, it doesn't hold. One of the problems with stanzas in today's world is that they've taken on the erratic nature of our culture. So whereas in the past, a stanza had a very specific kind of organization, groups of lines that would be organized into, I think this is, I'm paraphrasing from Longmans, I think. Or it would be organized into things that are themed based on metrics, based on rhetoric, based on music, based on narrative. It would have had an organization and grounding force that brought things back together again, even though things would break in the middle, for example, to give it tension, but the whole of the thing would be structured. One of the problems, of course, is that when structure breaks, the stanzas break. So where a couplet holds still, for us, the notion of two holds some really basic meaning, couples, couplet, things that have a logical structure, things that are usually a succinct or a closed grammatical unit. They're also brief. You can present in couplets, for example, you can present beginning and ends, things that have sort of a closed universe. We still, numerology tells us, because there are many, many people who still use it as a basic of understanding, whether that's in magical practice of any kind or another, or just in the sense of familiarity with something like a number 2. Couplets still hold that power over us, but the problem is that the larger framing doesn't. So one of the things that's happened in poetry in the last 100 or so years is that stanzas and the power of them have started to have broken down. And so now they're essentially erratic, and one can use them. And often it's a mindless sort of thing. We don't really adhere to the old sort of logical structures anymore. We just go by intuition, and intuition is going to be resting on smaller and smaller pieces of common ground, like our understanding of the number 2. The argument in the course, in the class, when we talked about it, was that what's happening in the world of poetry today, and we as poets have to contend with, is it's harder and harder to find common ground. And so you have to make more and more decisions about where you want to sit versus your own take on reality and reaching out to a reader. One of the things that suggests is that silence, that is white space, is replacing the power of the stanza. The stanza held the world together. It was a textual reality. There were things there that were unalterable or thought to be unalterable, and text was one of them, which isn't surprising given the notion of sacred texts, for example. But what's happening as we lose that capacity to believe in that, and in our current culture, whether we'll return to it or not, I have no idea. What's replacing it is we've moved from the island, if you think of the island as the text, to the sea, which I think of as, well, it's not silent, I know, but in this metaphor, it's the silence, it's the white space. So what's happening is that there's more and more work being done in poetry with respect to white space, more breaks, erratic lines, spaces, indents in front of some lines and not others. Radical white space. So I'm going to put links to a poem by John Cage, for example. White space that mimics something else, in his case, bars of music. There's our world as it disintegrates culturally, so that we don't have as much in common anymore, and we cannot guarantee as Andrew Marvellus and his Coy Mistress is a poem that I talked about in the class. We cannot guarantee that everyone understands what a coy mistress is, that it's okay to have one, that it's okay to treat her like a reluctant lapdog. Pardon me, my politics are showing. There is that reality is gone. And while Marvell had an inbuilt audience, that is everyone who was educated more or less like he was, that was his readership. He knew that they would have shared values. We do not have that. So it becomes a question of how you choose to write. Where we still have places where we have fairly intense agreed shared value, often in literature anyway, end up being in places like genre fiction. So when you go by a sci-fi novel or a fantasy novel or a romance novel, you know what you're getting. it's going to follow a trope. It's going to follow an agreed upon set of rules that might be spurious and ridiculous, but they are an agreed upon set of rules, and that is super, super comforting. Does that mean poetry can do that? Yeah, it probably does mean that. Whether or not you as a poet want to do that, that's another thing entirely, but that's becoming the battle now. We have lost the inbuilt audience, and that's not anything we can do anything about. Not as individuals, anyway. I doubt whether that's in this world that's going to be replaced. So that's a question for another time. We'll talk more about that in 202. But for this session, the idea is to look at poems and realize that what stanzas used to give us in poetry no longer work the same at all. They have a different kind of logic. And white space has taken on the role that some of that logic used to provide us. And that it means that silence has become far more powerful than it used to be. And I would say it's equal to, if not slightly edging out, the world of text. The silence is the sea versus the island. And we are, at this point, adrift. Next time, it's session 10, and that's the last session for 101.